So what I would like to present today is the fundamental structure, kind of the highest level of the structure that we're talking about in terms of hashkafa and so on. You know, fundamentally, I've been focused on really the idea of the concept of the Ein Sof and Tzvivus, and the concept of the Zolosoi, that the Zolosoi has a fundamental problem with the Nam Ksufa, which he has to solve and so on. But the truth of the matter is, when you look at the overall structure, you're really seeing something a little more problematic and a little deeper. And I'd like to present the underlying structure on a somewhat deeper level to some extent, because this is where we'll be kind of going in the future to some extent, to understand what's really happening over here and so on and so forth. It seems that the ultimate problem that we're having when we boil down the issue to Nam Ksufa of the Zolosoi, you know, as I've said before, Olam Hazeh, which is this world, in a certain sense can be summarized by the word becoming. In other words, this is the world which is dynamic. It changes, it moves from one point to another. So therefore what we see is a certain movement in time which exposes the possibility of change. So therefore we see that the world really is a summary of the Zolosai becoming a different entity from one position to another. And the world of Olam Haba is really the world of being, not becoming, where the Zolosai reaches a certain point when he exists as a certain entity, a certain being, and that existence is an existence which is really not subject to change. It's really a being which is constant and fixed. And that's called the concept of Olam Haba. So therefore what we see is that Olam Hazeh, this world, is a condition of becoming. And Olam Haba is a condition of being. And fundamentally what he becomes in that sense is a Zolosoi, but what he becomes in a certain sense is a subject. The whole goal is for the Zolosoi to become a true subject. And fundamentally this concept of a subject is a being who exists through his self-awareness. I mean, he actually has self-awareness and he knows himself through his self-awareness. And that process of self-awareness is actually an aspect of the knowledge of existence. In other words, self-awareness is existence itself. Existence as such is not a process which is fundamentally attached to an essence. It's not really something which can be shared by different entities so that each entity can exist. But actually, existence is something which proceeds from an entity, not to an entity. In other words, an entity is not given existence, and that existence is not a process which can be shared by other entities which are given their existence. That's really the concept of an object. If you're given existence, and therefore that's why you know you exist, because you are aware of that which was given to you, you're really an object, because that's what an object is. And because existence is a process which is given to an entity or to an essence, therefore you can have many of them. You can have multiple entities, or what's called a multiplicity of objects. Whether you're an inanimate object or a plant or an animal, you have the existence that's part of reality because you're given the existence in reality. So you, therefore, are really an object attached to a reality outside of you. And that reality which is outside of you is called existence, which is a certain process of being. And that is given to the identity of the entity. So that's why we see existence the way we do. All of Olam Hazeh is designed to produce a certain type of being called an object. And fundamentally, that process of existence, it's what's paramount in the world of becoming. There are many entities, all of which exist, which means that they share in the process called existence. But what we also said is something very profound, which is that there's another kind of entity, which is not an object. And it's a very different type of entity. It's an entity which is called a subject. And what exactly is that? That means that the entity called a subject does not exist in the usual term, where existence is not a process which is attached to the entity. That's right. But rather the existence of the entity comes from the entity. So therefore, the entity, the identity of the entity itself, or the essence of the entity, is first and foremost before the existence of the entity. And the existence of the entity proceeds or comes from the entity itself. It is a feature of the entity, and that feature is called self-awareness, consciousness, where he's aware of himself by himself. He's aware of himself, and that's the way he exists. He knows that he exists. He knows of his core by itself. Why? Because that core of his being possesses self-awareness. It's the awareness that he is. And that's truly what a subject is. A subject is a being who knows that he is by self-awareness, by consciousness. And that existence is understood as being at its core. In other words, if you are an entity, truly a subject, you must exist, because the existence comes from you as an entity, and so on. And this is something which is very strange. We normally have never thought of ourselves as an entity which possesses its own existence in itself. In other words, we don't possess the property of existence because it's a process which is attached to us. Rather, it emanates from our sense of who we are. So in a certain sense, who we are, our identity, precedes what we are. And this is somewhat shocking, because we used to think that the main thing about us is that we exist. So the main consideration of us is what we are, that we exist. And then the second consideration is who we are, what our essence is. What is our nature and our essence. But that's the world of objects. What we are precedes who we are, and that's an object. But a subject is who we are. What kind of entity are we are, and so on. Who we are precedes what we are, that we exist. Because existence comes from consciousness. That's really where it comes from. It's not separate from consciousness. It's part of consciousness. Consciousness is a knowledge of the fact that we exist. That's the essence of consciousness. It says to us who we are. We exist intrinsically in ourselves as a conscious being. So therefore, from who we are comes the idea of what we are, that we exist. What we are does not precede who we are. And this is a very strange idea, because the idea of existence seems to be more fundamental than the idea of an entity. You know, the ability to exist is considered in philosophy and ontology the greatest of all properties. Existence is a property of entities. And when existence is shared by many entities, they all exist. But that's not really what the universe is. The universe is composed of objects. The universe is composed of galaxies and stars. Hundreds and hundreds of billions of these things. The universe is composed of inanimate objects. The universe is composed of plants and animals. And all of these things, all of these are really objects. They are entities that emerge from the concept of existence. They are all here. The only entity that does not exist at all like that is a subject. And that's a human being. That's a person. That's the Zulosoi. So the essence of the Zulosoi is that who we are is most important. And since who we are is an aspect of consciousness, our existence proceeds from our consciousness. And that's when we know what we are. Now, this is not an easy concept to know, because I've completely reversed the whole problem of entities and their existence. That existence does not come first, and this applies to entities. An entity is not an application of a certain type of existence. It's not. Rather, existence is the fundamental property which is included in the entity. If you are conscious, you are self-aware. And if you're self-aware, you exist as part of your being an entity. And that's a subject. That's a real subject, and so on. And it's very difficult to describe this subject in these terms. But a subject is someone who knows that he is from his being as an entity. And he knows that he exists through his consciousness or self-awareness. Now, given this fact, I hope I've explained it to some extent, I hope I've explained it in a clear sense. There's a certain problem that emanates, a massive problem emanates that has to do with God, and it has to do with the Zulosoi. Because of the nature of the entities that we are, there is a tremendous problem in the coexistence of these subjects. In other words, two subjects cannot coexist. That's right. Whereas an objects can coexist with each other. You have many, almost an infinite amount of objects. But you can't have really two subjects. The ability of two subjects to coexist is impossible. You see, when it says Hashem Echad, you're saying there's one God. But there cannot be another God. There cannot be another subject which exists. The nature of a subject is that it can only exist by itself. Its existence is part of it. It's part of its essence. You see it. And therefore, its existence is unique to that entity. It emanates from the entity itself. It cannot be shared. It cannot be distributed. And therefore, it accounts for the entity and its existence. Now, you cannot have another one. Only one such entity can exist, the entity of a subject. That's why we say that Einoid Murvadoi, there's nothing but God. What do we mean by that? What that means is that that's not a property of God, that nothing else can exist from him. But that's an intrinsic value of God himself. It means because since his existence comes from his being, it comes from his consciousness, nothing else possesses it. It's unique to him. It's part of his consciousness. Just like God is self-aware and conscious, God can only exist by himself. It's only something that he possesses. It's part of his being. So therefore, what we say about God is Einoid Muvadoi, or Einoid. When you are a subject, you are the only one that can exist. And the exist comes from you. Your exist comes from you as an act of your consciousness. It doesn't come from other things. It cannot be shared. It only comes from an entity who has it, who is it. So therefore, God is the only being that can exist. He is the only being that has this quality called existence, because it really, the existence proceeds from his consciousness, from his being. God is the beginning and the end of anything else. Everything must proceed from him. Everything is contained in God. God is not surrounded by something called reality, which refers to the entire scope of existence itself. There's no such thing as reality when it comes to God. In other words, God is reality. He's the only reality that can exist, because he actually includes existence in his essence. So only he can exist, nothing else. So this points to a certain property that we mentioned before, but it was difficult to define, the property of centrality. What is centrality? Centrality refers to the concept to be central, to be the beginning and end of something called existence. Since God is the only one who can exist, because he is existence itself, he is central to the possibility of an object. All objects must proceed from God. Existence does not apply to God. God implies existence, and it proceeds from him. So therefore, God is the center of all existence. He's the only one that best could maybe try and share his existence. And this we call creation. It means that God is sharing that which is unique and special to him. And then something else can exist. But even that something else which can exist doesn't surround God. It's not in addition to God. It does not produce the equivalent of a number, the number 2. There's no duality possible with the nature of an absolute subject. You see, what I'm really talking about is not qualities of God. In other words, the essence of God is that he's a subject. That's his essence. That's what he is. And when you are a subject, we call God, God, because he's awesome. And he seems to defy everything that we possess. It seems to be that everything which we possess, he possesses in an infinite number. So God, therefore, is quantitatively much greater than all of us. He is smarter than us. He is more powerful than us. He's located everywhere. So God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. And that's why we call him God, as the supreme being. But the truth of the matter is, God, it's not that God is a supreme being, and therefore he's abnormal. God is what's normal. If you are a subject, this is who you are. You are not superior to everything else, which we consider There is no everything else. So only a subject who has his existence as part of him can be called God. So God is a term that we use, you see it, to distinguish between God and ourselves. We are beings who are created by God, and God is the ultimate supreme being. But that's really a false view, you see, because there's no duality between God and us. God is a subject, as a subject is defined by producing its own being, and therefore nothing else exists but God himself. So in that way, God is a subject. The term subject is higher than the term God, because the term God implies something in comparison to us. But God doesn't have his existence in comparison to us. In other words, as it relates to us, nothing can exist but God, because existence itself is part of his awareness, and therefore it is him. Nothing is there outside of him. That's why the statement Einoid is the greatest statement of all. It truly describes the truth of what God is. God is, the term is. Ising, being, emanates from God. He doesn't emanate from being. He is not an example of an entity who is. He's not an example of such an entity. Being is a quality that comes from him. He doesn't come from being. Being comes from him. And that's the true concept of a subject. That's what we mean by centrality. He is centrality. He's central to all reality. Why? Because reality proceeds from God. It doesn't apply to God. God is therefore not a part of reality. Reality is a part of God. And that's why the term Hamokum, God is called the place. What do I mean the place? Because he's the center of reality. There is nothing outside of that center of him. So therefore, I choose to eliminate the term God, because it's only used in reference to us, in comparison to what he is to us. But there is nothing outside of him at all. So we cannot apply to him what's called a relative term. When you call someone a father, that's called a relative term. Why? Because a father is defined as someone who has another relative term, a child, a son, a daughter. So a father is called a relative concept. The same thing as the concept of king. King refers to someone who has a malchus, who has a kingdom. It's a relative term. It's a term which is used to define something in its relationship to something else. So the term God is also a relative term. It's a term that it tells us he's an entity which has created everything else. Okay, and that's a relationship. But God is not an entity at all. God is the only entity that can exist. It's not a relationship. The term God is a relationship term, but the word subject is not a relationship term. The term subject is a term which is distinct by itself. It can have no duality, it can have no other. It can have no reality. Subjects don't have a reality. They don't exist in a reality. They are reality. So the word subject, I consider to be higher than the term God. Now, the important characteristics of a subject is that there cannot exist two subjects. And this is what's critical. The problem of Namdik Sufa is really a problem of the coexistence of two subjects. Him, God, and us. And this is an impossibility because there's nothing that can exist outside of a subject. A subject does not tolerate the relationship. It is completely exclusive. So therefore, nothing can exist outside of it. So the word God is always used as a comparative subject when you compare subjects to each other. When you say one subject is superior or higher than another subject, that's when the word God comes into account. But since this whole thing is an impossibility, only a centrality is the only one that possesses centrality. In other words, a circle, if you take the geometric figure of a circle, we have a circle has a center. A center to what? What does it mean it has a center? Well, the center is the one location in relationship to its circumference, which appears outside of the center. So when we do a circle, we really draw a figure. It's a plane figure in geometry. It's composed of the center of the circle and the circumference of the circle. And the circumference is extended outward from the center. That's what we mean by a center. A center to us is a relational term. When we say that there's a center to something, we are saying it's the critical position of the notion of a center. But it relates to another position outside of it. So there's something called a center and there's something called a peripheral, which is outside. But the two terms, center and peripheral, it's really a duality. But since God is not a duality and nothing can exist outside of him, God is not a center. So what do I mean by center? God is not a center of anything because there's nothing outside of him. But what do I mean by center? I don't mean a relative position. I'm referring to a source. God is fundamentally the source of reality. He is the origin of reality. He is the source of that which is outside of him, so to speak, which is called reality. But we have to use the word center to describe the fundamental being that God is, because he is the source of everything. And even though he's the source of that which is outside of him, nothing really truly exists outside of him. So it's a fictional term when we say centrality. God has no center. He is not the center of anything. There is nothing outside of him. So therefore, he's not the center of anything. He has no center. But for all practical purposes, we have to describe God to some extent in terms of our relationship with him. And in terms of our relationship, we say that we are outside of God in the sense. When we see God, we say what? We say me, you. So we talk about God as if he's an entity that's an object. When I refer to God as a you, I'm referring to God as an object, which is outside of me and which I am outside of. So it's impossible for me to talk in any sense of a non-duality. My very language incorporates the idea of a duality, but this is only me as an object, because a human being is an object, and that's what Olam Hazeh is. Olam Hazeh, which is the world of becoming, applies to objects. An object can become. He can change, but a subject cannot change. He cannot become. So therefore, the consciousness of a human being is kind of a half measure. He is kind of an object and he's kind of a subject. But he is not the absolute subject of what God is. Now the fundamental problem is, how do you create anything outside of God, since nothing can exist outside of him? So what does it mean you create something outside of him? So the truth is, the Zulosai was never created by God. He wasn't, even though that they say that, Yesh Me'ayin, something from nothing. But the truth is, the Zulosai is not created from nothing. So how was he created? He is derived. That's right. The Zulosai really derives from the self-awareness of God himself. Consciousness, or the knowledge of me, is fundamentally God himself. And from that me of God, from his consciousness, emanates a certain piece, a certain component, which is the Zulosai. So fundamentally, the Zulosai is derived from what? From God, that which we call the absolute subject. So in a certain sense, that's why God says, I am you. When God refers to the concept of me, of the me, of the Zulosai, God says to that Zulosai, I am you. You're not outside of me. You are derived from me, from my consciousness. But you are derived from me in such a way that there appears to be a duality, me and you. But it doesn't exist. There is no duality between me and you. I am you. There's an absolute unity between me and me. But you are the closest thing that I have created that is a subject. In other words, you are not really an object. You see it? You are not dominated by something called reality. The only reality that you're dominated is me. I am your reality. And I'm your only reality. Because there's nothing outside of me. So Zulosai is a very unique being. He's a being which is part subject. Why? Because he knows himself by himself. He has an inner core that sees everything outside of it. He sees everything as a you, me, you. Why? Because he almost has a core in him which seems to be almost outside of God. Because when he sees God and talks about God, he says, you, Ato, you, Baruch Ato, blessed are you. So in a certain sense, the Zulosai sees God as outside of him, even though God is not really outside of him. God is called an absolute subject. There is nothing outside of him. And the Zulosai is called a relative subject. He feels that there could be something outside of him. And who is that? God. But the Zulosai also possesses the concept of centrality. Because we know that reality really precedes, the knowledge of reality really proceeds from the Zulosai. Reality comes from the five senses, the sensory organs. But the sensory organs produce an image. The eyes, the ears, the nose, the sense of touch, and the sense of taste are really ways of knowing that which is outside of us. But what do we really know from that which is outside of us? We only know that which we know from our sensory organs. These sensory organs produce a sensory image, and that image appears in the mind, in the self-consciousness of the subject. Does it appear outside of our mind? No. Our mind is like a camera which simply takes a picture. It takes an image, which in a certain way is like called a demus. It takes a picture of it. But what does the object really look like? Vision is not something that we see outside of ourselves. When we have a vision, we see something that's produced in our mind. So therefore, every one of the senses produces an image of something which appears to be outside of us. What is that something? Is it real? Well, it seems to be real because it's producing an image, but the image that we have is only in our brain, in our mind. It's really settled in our mind, which is produced by our brain in a certain way. Do we have real knowledge of that which is outside of us? No. We only have knowledge which is in our mind, because our mind receives the signals from all the sensory organs or the organs which produce the image. So what we really know about anything is what our sensory organs produce as sense perception. Sense perception is nothing more than the production of certain images in our brain, and we know this because we are connected to our mind. Our mind is part of us. We are conscious, and therefore we have a mind. And in that mind, sensory organs create a picture of some sort, a picture of seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, and so on. So therefore, in a certain way, in terms of interpreting what reality is, we have a centrality. We are the center of the production of the image which corresponds to that which is outside of us. Can we really ever know what's outside of us? No. The only thing we can know is what's the image which is produced in our mind. We never can know that which is outside of our mind. So therefore, we will never be knowledge. We will not ever have knowledge of anything outside of it. Every human who sees another human will never know who that human is or what he is, because he is not in touch with that human. He's simply in touch with the image which is in his mind of that human. So therefore, he can communicate with that human through his mouth. But that's it. Communication is done with the mouth. That's why the intimacy between two people is designated by a kiss. A kiss is the union of two mouths. That's the point of communication between one human and another. Every human is connected to every other human through the senses. But the fundamental sense is in the mind. The only way we can communicate with another human is through that which is produced by our mouth. So therefore our mouth is the essence, is the center of our ability to connect to another being, which is also a subject outside of us. But the fact of the matter is that we have a certain centrality. And the centrality of us and the centrality of God are oppositional. They cannot exist at the same time. That means that two subjects cannot coexist. It's impossible. How is that? There cannot be an independent existence outside of a two subject. God, who is a two subject, does not tolerate another coexistence. Because existence only emanates from him. God does not have a you. But the Zolosai thinks it coexists with God, and therefore it calls God a coexistence. And that's a sign of its core, and so on. But the two cannot coexist. They're oppositional. In other words, the problem for God is that since he cannot coexist with anything, because anything is another being besides God, and it has no existence at all. So therefore, what emanates from this inability to coexist is the concept for God called yichud pressure. The yichud of the Bnei Shalom, which is beyond the number one, does not allow anything outside of it, because that which is outside of it cannot possess any being at all. Being is only exclusive to God as the ultimate subject. So therefore, the yichud pressure, the absolute eternity of God and the absolute existence of God does not allow a duality. He does not allow another subject to exist as a you of himself. That yichud pressure immediately annihilates anything, any other subject. Because to be another subject truly is to possess an existence, a consciousness which is outside of God. That's what it means, a subject. A subject is someone who possesses a core, a knowledge of himself by itself. And the by itself means that the core of a subject lies in the subject. So if we are truly a subject relative to God, we are independent of him and outside of him, which is impossible. So this presents a problem. We have therefore the problem of the coexistence of two subjects together, and that's impossible. Immediately, the absolute existence of God will annihilate anything which purports to be outside of him or independent of him. So therefore, the fundamental problem that God has in creating the Zulosai is that you cannot create something which can coexist with him. This is the fundamental problem that God has. And therefore, his yichud pressure of maintaining that absolute unity will annihilate anything which competes with him, which has a sense of its core, a sense of itself, a sense of its own consciousness outside of God. So how does this work? So therefore, this works because God says to the Zulosai, I am you. But in order for you not to be me, because I am you, but you are not me, I'm going to create in you a component that you believe is not me. You believe belongs to you and you alone. So that's why what God said to Zulosai is the following: I am you. I am absolutely you because you share my consciousness. You are derived from my consciousness. But I'm going to give you a gift where in a certain way you will have some kind of consciousness outside of me. And therefore you will always see me as a you. So therefore I am you, but you are not me. But in order for that part, the you that's not me, you have to harmonize with me. That's right. The solution to the problem of the impossibility of the coexistence of two subjects lies in the fact called harmony. The word harmony is a solution to the problem. In other words, it's true that you can never obtain existence outside of me. Because I am always you. Well, I will allow the possibility in some level where you can think that you're outside of me. You can think that you possess an existence in some way which is separate from me. But first you have to harmonize that existence. You have to agree to that existence. You have to believe that I am you. I am still you. There is no us. There is no you. There's no me, you. You have to formulate that belief about the truth of your coexistence. And in order to do so, that's your Namdik Sufa. Why? Because in a certain sense, the fact that I exist outside of you, God says, threatens your centrality. You think that you are the beginning and end of existence. You are the beginning and end of reality. Reality comes from you. But the truth of the matter is, it doesn't come from you. because there's no reality outside of you. But I will let you believe in a certain reality which is outside of you. So I will let you have the belief that you are not me. I will give you what's called an identity which appears to you to be outside of me, but which is not. But you will have to establish that identity. You will have to do something that establishes that identity. And that's called the tikkun of Namlik Sufa. Because Namlik Sufa is you believing that there is something outside of me, but that's impossible. Why do you believe that there's something outside of me? Because there's a part of you which I claim is not me. I'm going to allow you to have a certain core and a certain identity which is outside of me, at least in your belief. But you still will have to accept my absolute existence, that I am you. So you will have to know this truth, that I am you, and I will allow you to have the belief that you are not me. So again, you have to have the truth that I am you, that you are part of me. You are not outside of me, but only if you participate in the belief of what? That you can be outside of me. In other words, you will see me always as a you. That's how you will see me, even though you will know in your core that I am you. Then it will be possible. Then it will be harmonized. The reality of you and the belief that you possess in yourself will be harmonized. You will be able to what? To see yourself, you will be able to know that I am you. You are, in other words, because you are from me. But I will allow you the possibility where you can see yourself as outside of me. I will give you a feeling of identity, self-identity. But you cannot have the feeling of self-identity by itself. In other words, you cannot believe in your self-identity because that will conflict with my yichud pressure. It will conflict with who I am. For you to believe 100% that you are outside of me will conflict with me. It will attempt to formulate a coexistence of two subjects, and that cannot be. You cannot exist independently outside of me. No way. It's impossible. But I will allow you to think that. I will allow your mind to believe that I am outside of you. So I will allow your mind to always see me as a me, you. But only if it's in addition to the fact that I am you too. That I am you, that you come from me. So you will have to hold these two thoughts, even though they are contradictory. And I will tolerate that. My yichud pressure will not annihilate you if you have these two thoughts in a harmonious way. That first of all, you will know that I am you. You are part of me and derived from me. But I will also allow you to know that you are outside of me in a certain way. You will have a self-identity which appears as an appearance to be outside. But if we are in harmony together, you will not be in absolute contradiction to who I am. Because as long as you feel and know that, that I, God, am you, you are derived from me, I will tolerate you having your own self-identity, that you will always see me as being somewhat outside of you. How does that work? How does that harmony actually do it? We really don't know. But that is the nature of Olam Haba. It's the existence of a contradiction between two truths. And that's the truth of what? That's the truth that I am you. And that's also the truth that you can see me as a you. Even though there's an essential contradiction between these two, I will allow that thing to do. So fundamentally, I will only allow you to exist if you harmonize with my existence. And that's where you come to understand what? That I am you itself. I am your source. I am your origin. And you accept that and you distinctly show me that you have this belief, then I will tolerate you seeing me as a you outside of you. But only then will I have this, will I not form this contradiction. How does this work? How does the contradiction of I am you, God says, but you are not me? Well, make up your mind. Which is it? Am I you and you are not me? Or I am not you and you are me? I mean, how does this work? How does the contradiction work? We don't understand how the contradiction works. But God compromises between his Einoid Muvadoi, that there's nothing outside of him, and still allows you to see him as outside of him. But he will allow that only if you truly exhibit your behavior that you also believe that you are from him. And this which allows your existence to be. You can coexist with God only in the framework where you harmonize your Nam Sufa with my Yichud pressure. And this is fundamentally the essence of what's going on. So in other words, even though it looks like we are a duality, when you, the Zulosoi, look at me, you see a me, you. So therefore you see a we. You see the pronoun we. Why? Because there's a duality. There's me and there's you. And me and you together produces the pronoun we. That there is a coexistence in terms of a certain reality. There's the coexistence of a we, which is not really true. There is no we. There's no two beings in the world. There's only me, God says. There's not you. You are not outside of me. There is no we. There is no pronoun that expresses a duality. But if you can also incorporate and merge this knowledge that there is no we, there's really only an I God. If you can demonstrate through your behavior, which I call mitzvos, who the I of me is, that you can demonstrate that you know and you accept the concept of I am you. There is only an I in the world. There is no we. There is no duality. But in the world there is only me as the only entity, the absolute subject what is. I will tolerate your self-identity. And suddenly you will have a tremendous love for me. So the only way that we can be your we is if you love me. The love that you will have for me because you come from me. And love is the feature that unites two beings that come from each other. In other words, I will only tolerate the acceptance of the pronoun we as it applies to me and you. Only if you love me. At the same time as you say we. At the same time that you say me and you have to love me as well. Because your love will say to me, I am part of you. God is part of the Zulasai. And therefore, you will accentuate the concept of I, God. I, God, am supreme. I, God, am the only thing that exists. And you have to tell me that in the language of love. Your love for me, because I am you, will tell me that the only thing that really exists in reality is the I of God. There is no such thing as the we of me and you. You are not outside of me. There's no such thing as a we. There is no duality between me and you. And I need you to express that through love. By loving me, by seeing me as a part of you, as the essence of you, as being the inner core of you, through loving me, by doing the mitzvahs, then I will tolerate yourself as a self-identity. So even though conceptually, in a certain sense, through your mind, you refer to me as a you, me, you, I will allow that. I will not confront that through yichud pressure. But you have to love me to harmonize with me and make that possible. And this is the essence of what it's all about. You have to admit and love me with all your heart and soul. If you love me in such a way, that love will dictate to me, will tell me that it's only I who exists and no one else. There is no such thing as a we. There's only I, God. And if you can love me, if you can express that concept through your loving me, then I will tolerate through my yichud pressure to see you as a self-identity, as something which is outside of you, in appearance at least, where you can say me, you to God. And this is a very deep concept. So the whole tachlis of the Zulosai, as the way I explained it, is to harmonize the Zulosai as a subject with God as a subject. Because two subjects cannot coexist, because the subject is himself, not shared by anyone else. That the subject himself, he's himself excluded from sharing his being with someone else. That's a subject. A subject does not belong in the network of reality where everything shares the process of existence. A subject is someone who doesn't share his core with anyone else. He is outside of everyone else. That's a subject. And that cannot be, because the yichud of the Monisham does not allow that possibility. So therefore the two subjects have to be harmonized, literally harmonized. So even though he knows by loving God that he is part of God and not outside of God, he knows that through his love of God, and that's established through the mitzvahs. That's what's established in the world of becoming. The Zulosai becomes the subject who admits that there's another subject who is the only subject. And he admits that through the feeling of love. That's why God gives us the mitzvahs, to demonstrate that we love him and that we are from him, but we are not outside of him. So God tolerates the fact that we see ourselves as outside of him. Because when we refer to God, we always say the word you. You means that he's outside of us and we are outside of him. God will tolerate this you, calling him a you, only if you've harmonized your being with him in the sense that he is not outside of you because you love him. And that's what love is. Love is the feeling that you have about another person. And what is that feeling of love? You feel that that person is not outside of you, but that person somehow is inside of you. You are part of that person, and that person is part of you. So love includes a tremendous unity between you and God. So the love that you will have of God by doing the mitzvahs will declare the unity between you and God. And at the same time, your feeling about yourself will be as if you exist outside of Him, because in concept you will refer to Him as me, you, even though in your feeling you will see yourself as part of Him. Now this seems to be a contradiction. Either you're part of Him or not. But both of these things are true in Olam Haba, in the world of being. That you are part of God. And that's demonstrated by your love of Him. And that's demonstrated in your love of Him as well, in actuality. But at the same time, even though you love God and you see yourself as part of Him, you will also have the possibility of seeing yourself as outside of God and calling Him a you. Both will exist. But they have to be harmonized. They have to be part of one system where love has to harmonize with self-identity. To truly love someone, you see him and you see yourself as part of each other. You don't see yourself as outside of each other. You see yourself as part of each other. That's what love is. But at the same time, you can have a sense of self-identity where you see yourself outside of God. How is that possible? That's possible only if you harmonize. If your self-identity harmonize with the concept of your love. You have to see yourself in some form as outside of God, because He's giving you a self-identity, an outer core. But He will only tolerate that belief in your self-identity if you love God and you see God as part of you and you as part of God. So this looks like a mutual contradiction, and this is the true meaning of the term ayin lo yirasa. No eye has seen Olam Haba fundamentally, because Olam Haba in being is a contradiction. There are two opposites that are occurring at the same time. And that is, I am part of God. God is not outside of me. I cannot say me, you. I can only say me in a me. That's who God is. And I am part of God, not outside of Him. And at the same time, I can also say, I am outside of God. God is a you and I am a me. Because I see myself as outside of Him. I have a self-identity. So these are contradictory, and God says, I will tolerate that contradiction. I will tolerate that, and my yichud pressure will not annihilate you. It will accept it. Only if you love me and therefore accept the fact that you are part of me. And in Olam Haba, you will be able to sustain the contradiction. You will be a subject, and you will see yourself as outside of me, as a subject, that you are outside of me. When you refer to me, it's a you, and you are me. You see me as a me-you combination. But I will accept that only if at the same time you love me. And by loving me, you see yourself, or rather you see me as being part of you, as being your inner me. So I am tremendously connected to you. So we have to establish this contradiction, which we will be able to feel in Olam Haba. How? Ayin lo yirasa. No eye has seen us. We do not understand how we can establish this contradiction, that we are part of God and that we are outside of God. Only one of these things can be true in logic. But in Olam Haba, which is the world of being in its ultimate sense, we will be able to absorb this contradiction. So that's why we have to do mitzvahs, to harmonize our relationship with that which created, that which we are derived from. And this is fundamentally what Namlik Sufa is. Because Namlik Sufa is a feeling that we have betrayed our centrality. We are not the only ones in the universe, and therefore we feel disempowered. Namlik Sufa is a feeling of shame, but it really means it's a feeling of disempowerment. We disempower ourselves because we feel what? That there's something outside of us. So we no longer feel central to reality. But at the same time, we're mistaken Namlik Sufa by loving God, by admitting that we are part of God. We are not outside of Him. So Olam Haba is really about the coexistence of two opposites. It's not about the coexistence of us and God. It's not about the coexistence of two subjects, because that's impossible. But it's the coexistence of love and independence at the same time. Love means that we and God are one. We're not outside of Him. But independence means that we and God are two. We are outside of Him. That's a contradiction. Our self-identity is contradictory to our love. You see. But that's Olam Haba. And in Olam Haba, Ayin Lo Asa. We cannot see the solution to this contradiction in the world of becoming, which is the world of Olam Hazeh, where we become that being in Olam Haba. We cannot see how this contradiction takes place. We cannot understand how we're masakin Namlik Sufa. We cannot understand how we remove the feeling of disempowerment we have because of Namlik Sufa. Therefore, the fact is, Ayin Lo Asa, no eye has seen. But what no eye has seen is the way we resolve the contradiction between being independent of God by saying me, you, but at the same time loving God as the fact that we are part of Him. He is not outside of us. He is us. And that's a contradiction. He is us and He isn't us. That's it. The contradiction is He is me and He is not, and I am not Him. How could that be? How could He be me and I not be Him and both be true? Because one is a reality, the fact that He is me, and the other is a belief that what? That I am part of Him. That's right. They are not on the same level. They do not coincide in a certain way. But they are compatible. They harmonize. And God therefore requires this harmony to exist so that it's possible on some level that He can coexist with us. So therefore, what are we seeing? The whole problem of Namlik Sufa is a problem of the coexistence of two subjects, which is impossible when it comes to God. Yet God will tolerate us coexisting with Him in appearance. In appearance, we do coexist with God. And God allows the co-appearance, that coexistence as what? As a self-identity, which seems to us like we do exist outside of Him. But only if we accept the truth that we are not outside of Him. And that's expressed in the terms of loving Him. That we love Him like we love ourselves. And when you have these two feelings at the same time, on some level they are not a contradiction. They are part and parcel of the same thing. Now next time I will discuss not the coexistence of us and God, which is impossible before harmonization, but I will discuss a new form of Namlik Sufa, which is the Namlik Sufa that exists between us and each other, the Zulosoi. Because when man became one being and man suddenly became two beings, he suddenly had a new version of Namlik Sufa, of two subjects. At first there was the two subjects contradiction between us and God, But when Adam Rishon, after the sin, suddenly became mankind, a new form of Nam Sufa arose, because suddenly there appeared to be two subjects, me and my Chaver. How is that possible? The essence of a subject is that it cannot coexist with another subject because it defies the principle of centrality. Everything comes from me. There's no such thing as reality outside of me. But when I see another person, I'm seeing another subject, another reality outside of me. So therefore my centrality is not compromised. Or rather, I should say my centrality, is compromised. Because there's another person. The existence of another person, another subject, besides myself, is a fundamental contradiction to my centrality. How could this be? How can we have the coexistence of two human beings to each other when the existence of one contradicts the power of existence of the other? And this was only created after the sin of Adam Rishon. Before the sin of Adam Rishon and Chava were the only beings where Chava was a zivug. So there wasn't such a contradiction. There was no such thing as mankind before the sin. We were all part of Adam Rishon. There was a unity. But after the Chet, where this unity was suddenly defied and mankind became a species called mankind, there's a contradiction between one person and another. One person and another cannot exhibit the concept of centrality. You have two centers, which is a contradiction. So therefore, a new Nam Sufa was created when mankind went from one person to become the species called mankind. So a new form of Nam Sufa, of this empowerment, suddenly took place. And therefore, those have to do with the mitzvahs bein Adam l'chaveroi. And just like with God, the way we harmonize with God by loving Him, that's the way we have to harmonize with another person, by loving Him. That's responsible for the mitzvah, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Just like God expects us to love Him and establish the unity between Him and you, He expects you to love another person and establish the unity which permits the coexistence of two subjects. But that I will explain next time that we get together. Okay, I hope I was understood. Any questions?
Yes. What is it about Olam Hazeh exactly that prevents us from comprehending, that makes it Ayin L'Rasa?
The concept of an object. The concept that existence is given to each one as a process that allows the multiplicity. Multiplicity is allowed in objects, not in subjects. You cannot have two subjects that can coexist together, but you can have two objects which coexist together, because each object shares in the process called existence. Existence is outside of the entity. Therefore, it can be distributed among various entities. So you can have a multiplicity of existence. But with subjects, it doesn't appear outside. It comes from the entity. And the existence which comes from an entity is unique. It only applies to that entity. It cannot be shared. So you cannot have a coexistence between two subjects. But you can have a coexistence between objects. And since this world is fundamentally based on objects, there's a very big problem in understanding this concept.
So we're an object-based world right now.
Yes. Olam Hazeh is an object-based world. It's not a world based on subjects. That's why it's so hard to understand the concept of subject. It's the most central concept, I think, of every concept in truth. The greatest concept of all, from what my perspective is the concept of a subject. Because a subject is a completely different type of being than an object. One permits the possibility of coexistence. You can have two objects coexistence, and they share in the process of existence, or they can't coexist because they're two subjects, and the existence of each proceeds simply from the entity itself. It cannot be shared. Okay, are there any other questions?
But your answer to that is that the minor subject, the Zulasa, was actually in actuality part of the major subject, the Ribbon Shalom.
Well, that's what God said.
That's what God said.
I will tolerate it.
Right. You'll tolerate it if you exhibit through mitzvahs the love that will bring you to all.
Right. It's only the love that we have to.
Right.
That's the way we harmonize.
Can you make an analogy? I know it's a very poor analogy, but maybe because it's difficult to. Let's say you look at, we have 50 states, and you've got a country. Now, how can you be part of the country if you're a part of the state? So that they said, you know what? I'll tell you what. Each of you states, I know you're all New Yorkers, you're all Missourians, you're Virginians, but if you have a loyalty, a love for this country, and you observe the halachas of the country, you're all.
Well, to some extent, that's
what I'm saying. It's not a contradiction anymore.
Right. Because as long as we maintain
why don't we use a better mushal? If Shimon, why don't we use a mushal of a zivuk existence? We can't exist as me, you fully, but we do exist. So as a we exist as a zivuk. Zivuk is this magic that you say that love makes the two people that are zivugim feel like they're part of each other. So it's a zivug existence. Yichud pressure will not annihilate that.
Right. Yes, that's also an example of zivug. When God divided the zivug of Adam and Chava into two people, in a certain sense, there was a unity between the two because they're part of each other, but there was also a separation and a self-identity. The woman has a different self-identity than the man, and it's a me-you. So the reality of the two of them was me-you, but the feeling between the two of them is me in a me. That's how they're harmonized.
That's next week's share.
Well, next week we're going to really think about this, the concept of Bein Adam Chaveroi, light. In some way, that's...
Shimon, I just want to ask one question, make sure I understand the point that you made in the beginning of this year. You said that in a state of being, there's no possibility of action. And just could you elaborate on that? Why not? State of being, of subject existence.
Action requires time, change. Action is a movement. The definition of action is a movement in time from one state to another. And a subject does not move. It does not change. It exists. And its existence is fixed. It's perfect. It means that which it is always is. It never changes. So action is part of the world of dynamic, world of movement. Whereas a subject is part of the world of being, pure existence as existence.
Understood. I thought that's what you meant. I just wanted to make sure.
Okay, so was I clear in the share today?
Yes.
Yes, very clear.
Very clear.
Okay, I tell you honestly, it's very difficult to be clear at this level. Very difficult because it's so abstract and so on.
To Abe's point, zivug is more a description of the Zolosai and God. In Adam L'Chaveiroi, to have a zivug type of relationship, besides the person's true zivug, his wife, I don't know, that's hard to say. But that's more of an organismic type of yichud.
Well, they say the Zolosai is the zivug of the Ein Sof.
Correct. But is the Zolosai a zivug of each other? Probably not.
No, it's not. It's not a zivug of each other. Two people are not a zivug of each other. Two people are really a fundamental. There's a difference between inter and intra, the pronouns, the prefixes. Inter refers to a difference between two objects that are separate from each other. Intra refers to a division within the entity itself. It's not a relationship of two entities. That's inter. Intra is within the entity itself. There's a division. And that's referred to as intra. So there's a difference. But in Adam L'Chaveiroi is kind of an intra. You know what I mean? Within the entity itself called the Adam, it's split. So another person is like your brother. He's like another part of the being. You know? Whereas an inter is the zivug, between two are together, but it's really composed of two different entities, the man and the woman. Whereas when you talk about the concept of the Zolosai of mankind, it's more like the internal connection between. They are both components of the same entity, whereas a zivug are two components of two different entities. But we'll perhaps go into that next time.
Shimon, one more point. Last week you were discussing the spheres, and I'm just wondering, I mean, you didn't say this specifically in the shir, but I'm wondering if I'm connecting the dots. It would almost seem that the primary function of the spheres are to take existence that's in form of being or subject and pull out, or somehow it's a mechanism to turn into an existence of object or not existence of becoming. That's its primary function. Is that a correct statement?
It's kind of, yeah. It's a mechanism. It's a mechanism which allows the a subject to tolerate its view as an object, but yet its feeling as a subject. It's a mechanism which tolerates free will.
Change.
Yeah.
So it's more than a model. It's the actual process of going from one form of existence to another.
It's right. It's as in that way. It's the anhogas.
Yeah.
As a hanoga, it's a mechanism, but there's another feature of spheres which is a model, and that's a very deep concept which I really haven't discussed yet. But that's another concept, the concept of the spheres being a model of the Zolosai, mamish. That's what's called the Dimin Eloki. But that's something that has to be understood. Okay.
You're saying
thank you for listening.
Shimon, you're saying a big chiddush. You're saying the two dinim in the spheres.
Yeah.
But yeah, wow, that's a big chiddush. Wow.
I know.
You need to elaborate on that, so I see.
Yeah.
Well, right.
Yeah.
No, because that was the problem after.
Shimon. A happy Tu B'Shvat, everybody.
Yes.
Just
happy
as
Tu
an
B'Shvat.